So I hope that the story of Marxian economics or Marxian political economy made it clear that in economics right now there are more questions than there are answers. Um, Maybe part of the attraction of neoclassical economics for a time was that it seemed to promise easy answers. You just have markets and everything will fix themselves. When we discuss things like the environmental problems, ecological economics, and then now we've discussed about Marxian economics, I hope it's increasingly clear that the economic ecosystem is much more complex than any one school of thought can provide answers for. And what we really need is a lot of in-depth economic investigations to take place now. We need economic investigators to do studies now to figure out really what to do with economies, and that's important because you're talking about the design systems of your civilization when you're talking about changing the economy. Some of the mysteries that came up during the Marxian discussion that kind of go through my head is, for example, you see the Soviet Union had great economic growth and incredibly fast industrialization. Was that because Marxian economics and socialism was just a very dynamic and strong system to organize an economy, or was it just a dynamic and strong system for organizing the economy in Russia in the 20th century, and it might not work elsewhere? Or was that economic growth just the result of cheap oil that existed in that era, just as it was the result of American growth in the 20th century was largely the result of cheap energy, cheap oil. Was growth in the Soviet Union just the result of technological change that was really spearheaded in the capitalist world, and then they just borrowed it? There's a lot, or was that technological change that emerged out of the Soviet Union the response of really robust government spending on tech and education? These are the types of questions that come up, and we don't really have answers. Or I would say there's a lot of economists with multiple answers arguing about that right now. Same thing with the obvious advances of China in the current period. What are those really about? Is China becoming so dynamic and growing so fast because of technology, because of cheap energy? Is it growing so fast because of Keynesian economic policy that was mixed with the Marxian policy? Or is it growing fast because it's a very effective bureaucracy that's scientifically managing the economy in an effective way? We need to study that. We have to figure out what those answers are. Now we're going to move to another area of studying the economy that also focuses a lot on exploitation and fairness and issues like that, just like the Marxian example did. And that's going to be discussing decolonial economics here. And we're going to do that in, I guess it's two major parts that break down into four parts. Let me show you what I mean here. Okay, so there's two components of it. The first is the critique of colonial trade exploitation and its continuing aftermath. This is one of the major components of decolonial economics. It's saying, well, there was a thing called colonization, and that impacted economies all over the world, and it actually really hurt economies that were not European, were not white, essentially, economies that were not the colonizers. The whole idea of colonialism was for colonizers to extract value from natural resources and colonized land and to extract work from labor. They destroyed existing countries and existing cultures on purpose in order to extract wealth. That was the model. So it's based on unfair exploitation of colonial areas. So decolonial economics kind of argues that many parts of the world and peoples within even wealthier economies are stuck with the dealing with the aftermath of colonization still. And one of those aftermaths is continuing racism, the continuing impacts of racism in economic systems. So that's one of the two components, that critique of colonialism. And you have here pictures that try and bring that to light. Colonial workers in colonized people sort of being used as labor for the leisure of colonizers, for example, or the increased wealth of colonizers. And also here from Canada, an Indigenous person, very sad because of the realization of the perhaps murders of children, and certainly horrible treatment of children who were taken from their families during the colonial period and the post-colonial period as well. And that country is still dealing with the issues related with that, its residential school system, and the breaking of indigenous cultures and indigenous families. So that's the first part of the two components of decolonial economics. The other one is a critique of Western-centric economics. What do they mean by that? Homo economicus is British. The economics was built on the development of this central core actor, Homo economicus, and there are a lot of critiques that, hey, that thing that they called a universal human, this Homo economicus thing, was just some Protestant British guy, right? And that's who they actually modeled. The entire discipline of neoclassical economics was modeled after this British guy. Well, that's ethnocentric, Western-centric. It doesn't properly depict actual diversity in human populations, so it doesn't really work for designing economies. You can't design economies on a core person that doesn't really exist. Okay, and another similar critique is that GDP is American. What do we measure when we're measuring gross domestic product? Turns out it was very American-centric or Eurocentric, again, Western-centric ideas of what's valuable and what's not valuable. So these are the two components that we're going to break down as far as decolonial economics are concerned. First one, here it is, unfair exploitation during the colonial period. So remember how the world was set up during colonial trade. The colonizing countries, the biggest of which was Great Britain, colonized many parts of the world, and you set up, what you do is you set up your colony to produce usually one or two major commodities, and these commodities would not be manufactured goods, they would just be extractive goods that you get from the land, either through agriculture or mining, essentially. So these are the goods that don't have a lot of what we call value added associated with them. They're the cheapest goods you can get. But industrial capitalism needs these goods in order to function. The idea of colonialism was to get these goods cheaply from colonized areas, bring those to, say, Great Britain, where you can use them in industrial processes. For example, Ghana was created before Ghana was a colonial territory. It was a number of tribes, a number of different areas, not really what you could call countries, but it had a varied economy of manufacturing or product creation of products in pre-industrial manufacturing, agriculture of various foods used for eating or clothing and whatnot. But once colonialism was established, the British really designed that economy to manufacture cocoa beans and to export those so that British manufacturers would have a supply of cocoa beans to make things like chocolate bars and things like that. The Gambia in West Africa was designed to grow peanuts in the same way and ship them to Europe and maybe the Americas. Guatemala was designed to make bananas and maybe a bit of coffee. Cuba, sugar. Colombia, coffee. India, cotton and spices. Brazil, rubber. These colonial economies were transformed to only serve the industrial needs of the colonizer. That's the point there. And to do that, they had to be transformed into colonies that only create one or two products through labor exploitation and land exploitation and ship them out to the colonizer. Each of these commodities was produced in multiple colonial territories. For example, it's not just, Guatemala that made bananas. It was also Honduras and El Salvador. So these territories are competing with one another. And this creates kind of a race to the bottom as far as prices are concerned. The price of bananas keeps going down and down and down and down. Why? Because competition between those countries that are producing bananas assured that those commodities prices declined year after year just through competition, as each one was trying to bring more agricultural land into production, therefore bringing more bananas into production to make more money by sending bananas, for in this example, to the colonial powers. So as a result, the cost of imported manufactured goods perpetually rose for those countries. Let's talk about Ghana's easy. The cocoa bean example is easy. A number of countries are producing cocoa beans. Cocoa beans are used to make chocolate bars, other things, but we'll talk about chocolate bars. So in the UK, they make chocolate bars in chocolate bar factories, but Ghana and other countries are now competing to make money that they need through the only commodity they can produce, because they've been set up colonial in that way. So they keep introducing more land into production of cocoa beans, putting more cocoa beans on the global market. That brings down laws of supply and demand, right? That brings down the price of cocoa beans overall. All of a sudden, cocoa beans are always worth less and less and less. And what do you get for the money that you make when you send those cocoa beans out? Manufactured goods like chocolate bars that are manufactured in England, televisions and cars for sure as well. So what did that mean? It created a declining terms of trade, it's called, for the former colonies. The value of those cocoa beans kept getting less and less and less. You have to make more and more cocoa beans and export them in order to buy televisions and in order to buy chocolate bars and things like that. So because of the lack of funds to diversify these economies, the only choice they had in order to get more of what they wanted, coffee and chocolate bars and televisions and things like that, the only choice they had was to try and exploit their own people and their own land more and more to export more cocoa beans. Increasingly, those countries were indebted more to the World Bank and IMF, as we've discussed in other parts of this course. So in order to pay back those loans, they had to create more cocoa beans and primary commodities and export it. All of this flooded the world with primary commodities, declining the prices of primary commodities, and making this declining terms of trade thing a more severe problem for colonial economies. And this was the case in the colonial period, but it also continued in the post-colonial period, or the period after colonialism, after the Second World War. Okay. Exploitation of labor clearly was a huge part of this. It wasn't just exploitation of land and declining terms of trade. Labor was part of it. Slavery was part of the colonial system. Here we have some rubber tappers in Brazil, clearly slaves. And people who fought this exploitation of slave-based exploitation were often forcibly moved to reservations. So you either were a slave or a semi-slave labor in the colonial system, or you were pushed out of the way. And in the case of Canada, that meant sending Indigenous people to the worst land in the country on reservations. And now still 50% of Indigenous in Canada still live in poverty because of this reservation system and marginalization of people existing original inhabitants of colonized areas. Okay, so exploitation of labor was important, and that was often racialized, right? There were white slaves, and white people were during the colonial period very much taken advantage of. We discussed that just in the Marxian economics section, but a lot of the most severe labor exploitation was pointed at non-white people, inhabitants of colonized areas. And often, as in the Indigenous of Canada, they were often cut entirely out of the economics of their own land and of the world. So, post-colonialism, this exploitation kept going on. but countries were able in that post-war period, the Keynesian period after the Second World War, they were able to correct a little bit of this through investing in diversifying economies, right? In amidst the Bretton Woods system with the IMF lending money to balance economies, currencies, the World Bank lending money in order to invest in diversifying economies away from just cocoa beans and those sorts of things. To invest in airports, et cetera, that Bretton and amongst the United Nations system, that during the 1950s to 1970s type period, well, that there was some improvement in former colonies, right, to have some economic growth and economic diversification. However, in the 1980s, it's been argued by many, and certainly it's argued in this cartoon, that the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank just kind of replaced the colonial powers as far as being a colonizer is concerned. Corporations became more powerful than most governments. The Bretton Woods system turned neoliberal, removing the power of governments, as we've discussed. They could the Bretton Woods institutions could reproduce colonial style exploitation systems in the former colonies. They could influence government in powerful countries to use military to gain cheaper resources. This is corporations could do that, and protect cheap labor sources. You can see this in the powerful corporations used governments to invade former colonies, just like happened in the colonial period, in order to get access to resources. And you really saw this, for example, in the United States invasion of Iraq for oil, and, well, the pressure and potential invasion of Venezuela for oil as well, and continuing pressure to get Venezuelan oil on the part of the United States. Critiques say that this is colonialism, right? A continuance of colonial exploitation. So there are strategies once you start looking at economics in a decolonial way. First of it is the neo-colonial policy, right? Powerful countries, you have to understand, if you know these sort of power dynamics and that they exist in economies, you have to understand that powerful companies use powerful countries and companies use economic and political power to keep poor countries as providers of cheap labor and material. And a lot of the economy of the world and a lot of the politics of the world is designed on keeping that relationship. The wealthy countries want cheap stuff in order to fund their economies, right? So decolonial policy then often has been to de-link poor economies from colonial powers. Just stop the relationship, try and stop the relationship in trade with these exploitative powers, as there seem to be. Often then you would use Keynesian style state-led internal economy building, like we've discussed before, or socialized economy, to Marxian style economic planning to provide for the welfare of people and build domestic economic capability. That's a decolonial policy by a country. Neo-colonial businesses. What do you do if you have a business and you want to take advantage of these inequalities? If we're going to be skeptical here, well, you cozy up to powerful governments so that they might use their power and might in your interest. If you're an oil company, make sure you fund those elections of those wealthy people in the United States so the United States can use its military to get you access to that resource oil that you want it to do. You want to have access to. You can also use your own large corporate political and economic power to undermine governments that want to assert control over their own resources in a similar way. So you try and exert power on governments in order to get what you want. Luckily, large businesses, if you're thinking from the business's point of view, they're powerful enough to corrupt governments. So you try and corrupt governments to get a colonial relationship that gets you access to cheaper resources. That's how you operate business in a new neo-colonial way. You can also operate your business in a decolonial way if you have ethical problems with the exploitation of people and environments. You can engage in ethical relationships, ethical trade, I should say, or fair trade, relationship-based trade, sustainable trade practices. There's fair trade products that there's a labeling system. You can get, coffee is where this really started. You can only say, if you want to have a decolonial business and it's a grocery store, only source things that are labeled fair trade, where the growers of that coffee are paid a fair price. And there's labeling systems that we have in our economy now. Relationship coffee is a similar thing, where you establish your business. Say you're a store in Canada or the United States. You establish relationship with an actual community in Guatemala that's trying to diversify its economy while producing coffee. You have a relationship. You agree to pay high prices for the coffee, and even go down there and try and find funds for them to invest in their local community. And of course, you can also engage in sustainable trade practices. These things are thought to be decolonial processes. They kind of push back on these colonial and neo-colonial economic realities to try and make kind of a better world through business. So that was the first part of this sort of economic studies of colonialism, neo-colonialism, and their economic impacts. Another part of that is really looking at the impact of racism, and that racism had in the colonial period, and now how that type of racial dynamic that was built in the colonial period continues in current times to impact economic action and impact economies in general. So let's take a look at that and go to a larger screen here. There we go. Let's look at economic studies of racism. Basically, there have been many studies that have found colonial-rooted racism to exist within current economic systems and current economic behaviors. And this might be the most famous one from the American Economic Review by Bertrand and Mulleinathan, I think you say it. And it's titled, "Are Emily and Greg More Employable Than Lakeisha and Jamal? A Field Experiment on Labor Market Discrimination." There's actually been a lot of experimental economic studies that really mimic this kind of methodology. And of course, what they did here is they found numerous job ads, and they submitted fake CVs, and they were paired, the fake CVs, the fake resumes. They would have one of the exact same resumes submitted for the exact same job, but put the name Greg on it, Greg something, and another one which would be exactly the same. They put the name Jamal on it. They'd have a pair of identical CVs and also submit Emily as one of them and Lakeisha as the other. They're changing the names, and of course these names are meant to be a signal of ethnicity, right? And they wanted to see who got hired more. Emily and Lakeisha had identical CVs, identical resumes. Who got hired? It won't be a surprise to many of you here that Emily was the one who was hired. Greg was also hired over Jamal. So it was thought that this was very strong evidence that there's discrimination in hiring in economic in the economy in general, and racism is something that has to be addressed in one way or another in the economic system. Here's another one by myself and Dr. David Wozniak from Eastern Michigan University. We published this in the Journal of Behavioral and Experimental Economics, and we did in Michigan an experiment in the lab, and we found evidence of discrimination in that experiment, where essentially people would choose not to hire somebody of a different race even though they knew that they were taking an economic penalty to do that. So in other words, they weren't being rational. They knew they were going to make less money by hiring somebody of a different race, but they did it anyway. It might have been that they didn't give it enough thought to realize this, but there was an obvious bias there in hiring in this laboratory situation. So we found pretty strong evidence of discrimination in hiring in this case as well. And there's a whole lot of studies that take this sort of form, finding discrimination in especially labor markets. So what are some strategies that have been used to counter this? First, policy strategies are used. Of course, what do? You reduce economic loss of racism by mandating fair hiring, I should say, practices. Of course, this can be really political. Should people have to be forced to have a quota of a certain amount of people of a certain race in their hiring? How do you enforce that that hiring is fair and not discriminatory without maybe discriminating against other groups? This gets very political. We're not going to get into that, but of course, if there is a discrimination in hiring and that actually does have an economic cost for economies and for businesses, then it's reasonable to want to do something about it. We're not going to be able to go deeply into those policies. You can also think of political strategies once you know this very well documented racism exists in economies. First, make sure you're always checking your own bias when hiring. If you're in HR, if you get in a position that you're hiring, you may be passing on a stronger candidate because of some unknown unconscious biases of your own, and it's good to really evaluate yourself if you're in the hiring position. Maybe you could not name your kids Lakeisha or Jamal. That doesn't seem very fair that you would have to submit to racism and not name your kids culturally appropriate names that you like in order to get them jobs. But some people have made that choice, saying, well, this is the reality. There's racism out there. I'm going to name my kids Emily and Greg. I'm not, even though I wanted to name them Lakeisha and Jamal. That's a very personal choice to make. You could join social movements that insist that people should not be penalized for their race or their cultural background, and do some sort of political policy making in that regard. But those are strategies often associated with the racism that's been shown to exist in economic systems. Economists really disagree about the true nature of racism, and this disagreement really comes down partially to just empirical studies. It's hard to study what causes racism, but also to ideological foundations. If you really believe in the neoclassical model, there are certain types of racism that you will just not believe exist. Let's make that more clear with the examples. What are these two types of racism that economists tend to talk about? The first is statistical racism. What is that? Well, neoclassical economics assumes that racism must be rational, right? Homo economicus is always assumed to be rational, and they want to, so racism must involve an attempt of Homo economicus to maximize their gains, maximize the money that they're making in the market, for example. So, what is racism when you consider this? Well, neoclassical assumptions in their pure form don't work in order to show racism, unfair racism anyway, to occur. So they move to sort of a Keynesian approach where racism is shown as a form of market failure based on lack of perfect information. For example, in the United States, where we did our study in Michigan, African Americans tend to score lower on math on average. And we created a laboratory experiment, which was a pretend market that people were to hire people and get real money rewards for doing it in the most efficient way. People needed to hire people for a math-based job, right? So if African Americans in the population tend to score lower on math on average because of lack of general educational support maybe in that country, then it follows it's rational for an employer to not choose an African American for a math-based job if they know the information they have on candidates and is not perfect. And usually in a job market, you don't have perfect information on a candidate. They could be lying on their resume, for example, right? They could have cheated on test scores or whatever. So where we did our study in the United States, these statistical things did hold. But what we did that was very different is we created a fake lab-based market where we could have the normal situation where there's imperfect information, and as expected in that market, we did find evidence of statistical racism. When people didn't have perfect information about the candidates they were going to hire in our pretend market, well, they tended to discriminate against African Americans. But because our study wasn't in the real world, because it was in a lab, we were able to give potential employers perfect information. If racism is based on these statistical rational assumptions, then once our employers or potential employers in our study had absolute perfect information, they basically got the test results of how each candidate performed on the task, the math task they needed to do. Once they had that information, they should stop discriminating, and that's really important because then we can say racism was statistical in nature. The other sort of racism that we could have found, though, is taste-based racism. That's a very pure form of racism, I guess. That's when it suggests that humans aren't necessarily acting rationally when they are racist. They just might have a bias against certain races, and they will subject themselves to economic costs just not to have, say, an African American, in this case, on their team. Right? So what did we find in our study? First, we did a situation where employers didn't have perfect information, and all employers did discriminate against the African American candidates. African American potential employers also discriminated against their own race, the African American candidates, and so did white employers. Then we changed in our study the situation, and we gave all employers just perfect information. How good is this candidate? And you would think that would erase racism. There's no question. This person, although they're African American, scored higher than everybody else on the math test. That's the one you should hire. This is not what we found. The African American employers who were on the hiring side of the market in our experiment did stop being racist in their hiring practices. So we could say for African American employers, it was a statistical form of racism. Once they knew the actual information, they stopped being racist against potential employees. But for the white contestants in our study, they continued to be racist. They continued to not hire African Americans, even though they knew the actual abilities of the African Americans. And they suffered an economic penalty. They made less money for this refusal. It was an unconscious refusal, but a refusal nonetheless with full information. So we were able to find out in a laboratory environment, an experimental economic environment, that taste-based racism did exist in certain forms. And that's really important because in the real world, we had to do this in a lab. And it's important we did it in the lab because in the real world, it's almost impossible to differentiate between the two major forms of racism, right? But policy for dealing with these types of racism would be very different. So if racism is all statistical, what kind of policies do you enact to deal with them? Well, maybe you want to supply more testing and other information of candidates, maybe math tests across the, country. So candidates can say, look how I score on the math. I'm great at math, right? That sort of thing. You can provide more educational opportunities and supports for historically disadvantaged groups. Okay, so African Americans tend not to do as well on math. They need more educational support. If you get rid of the average racial difference, you won't have the racism anymore if racism is statistical in nature. But if racism is taste-based, it's more enduring, right? And you really would have to create laws and policies just against discrimination based on race, because that discrimination is not rational. And even so, as our study found, that costs businesses a lot of money. Discrimination causes them to hire weaker candidates than they would if they weren't discriminating. So if it's taste-based discrimination, there's a different set of policies. So that's an example of how economists might study racism in various ways in today's economic field. So the second group of decolonial issues with economies is the idea of ethnocentrism. Or Western centrism or Eurocentrism. When we speak in these terms, we're talking about a cultural bias in our own analysis. So as an economist trained, growing up in a Western country, educated in economics, I might look at the world and only interpret it through my culturally biased lens. So related to this is the idea that Homo economicus, which was devised by neoclassical economists to represent the most universal thing that a human is, well, maybe the critique of this is they were actually just looking at British, and particularly Protestant British people, and making their model of what they think a rational human is. And that's very dangerous, because if a human is seen to diverge from that particular model, well, because they come from a different culture or something like that, they're just interpreted as being wrong, not rational, not quite human. And that, of course, can bleed into the racism that we just discussed and a lot of the colonial issues that we have already discussed. So as an example here, Homo economicus is extremely individualistic, right? That's the whole idea. You're greedy and you try and get as much wealth as you can. That's the whole point of Homo economicus. Turns out that level of individualism is very culturally specific. And when colonial powers and neo-colonial powers came into contact with other cultures that weren't acting in this very individualistic way, they actually started to enact large social and cultural engineering campaigns through agencies like the World Bank, for example, in order to create global populations that would act more like Protestant British people, because that's what they thought was the rational thing to do, because that's what Homo economicus looked like. For example, here's countries ranked by the amount of individualism. No surprise, the United States is the most individualistic country on earth. Same with the United Kingdom. They're tied. But if you go down the rankings, you see countries like Indonesia, Trinidad, Peru, Korea, the Republic of Korea, that's North Korea, Bangladesh, Vietnam, Chile, etc., Bulgaria, Mexico even, as very much more collective, non-individual countries. And it's not really that important which countries are more individualistic and which less, but you can just see that cultures of the world really range a lot on the amount of individualism that they have. So it's very difficult to suggest that there's this guy, Homo economicus, and this is the core of what it is to be a rational human. When you do that, you're suggesting, according to this critique of ethnocentrism, you're suggesting that it's only Americans and British people that are rational, and the rest of the countries are made irrational because of their culture. Some people, again, have thought of this as racist. It's a very ethnocentric way of looking at the world. Now, here's some examples of this. Adam Smith said industriousness, greed, and rationality are natural once culture is removed, and these features drive economic success. if this is natural, actually, this is what he actually said. He said, I'm not going to take the time, he said, Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations, I'm not going to take the time to question whether industrious and greed are cultural or natural. I'm just going to say that that's what people in England seem to act like. And this is how we'll analyze them in a market with the supply curves and demand curves and things like that. So he pushed that question of whether Homo economicus was natural or cultural aside. And actually, largely, this is because he had already written a whole book on it. And Adam Smith decided that actually there was no rational greed that was the core of humanity, that this was actually just cultural. Okay, so he's in his Theory of Moral Sentiments book that was before his book on The Wealth of Nations. Adam Smith himself said, no, there's no real universal Homo economicus, economic man. We are all cultural. Max Weber, second picture here, suggested that it was the Protestant work ethic in England that made Homo economicus act like that. He said that this Protestant religion in England made people need to show their wealth on earth as proof that they were loved by God and they were going to go to heaven. So it created a culture of people who were desperate to have money and show that they have money, to work, put their head down and work and create economic value, because they were desperate to prove to themselves, really, that they were going to go to heaven instead of to hell. That's a very cultural thing, but that's how Homo economicus was designed. My door magically opened because my dog came in the room. Okay, Karl Polanyi saw this, and he saw these political economists like Adam Smith writing in the early days, looking at this desperation, first of all, the Protestantism in the UK, but also the desperation around what Marx wrote about with that dispossession and the creation of this desperate workforce through the enclosure movement and the pushing of peasants off land. Karl Polanyi looked at that and said, wow, people like Adam Smith were seeing this, and they were seeing people being very greedy and very individualistic and self-interested. And they thought that this was the natural core of what it is to be a human. Karl Polanyi said, those people are wrong, and they just didn't realize that what they were watching was a particular culture and a group of very exploited and disenfranchised people within that particular culture. And he famously said of this that no misreading of the present, I didn't put the word present in here, no misreading of the present ever proved more prophetic of the future. Karl Polanyi said, you're not understanding the economy, when he was talking about the political economists like Adam Smith, looking at these desperate poor people and saying they were this Homo economicus type beast. They have misinterpreted this, but with that, they built an entire economic theoretical architecture that changed the entire world. So it created the future through a misreading of the past. It's important to note that also there's been found in economic studies that there's no clear benefit of individualism versus collectivism in entrepreneurship, because you need to collaborate in entrepreneurship. It turns out collaboration and collectivism actually are very good tools to use in entrepreneurship anyway. So there's argument about whether or not individualism and greed is even good for economics. But this idea of this Homo economics, this rational, really British Protestant man, as being the necessary ingredient for a successful economy, was transported and exported by the colonizers during colonialism. It was a colonization of the mind, according to Frantz Fanon. That's the last picture here. Frantz Fanon was a psychiatrist and psychoanalyst and also kind of a political economist, and he said that one of the most successful things that colonialism managed to do was colonize the minds of the colonized people, so that they believed that their culture was wrong and they had to become rational Homo economicus type creatures. So that's how culture became really politicized as far as economics is concerned. There's another element, a second element to this ethnocentric critique of economics, and that is the idea of how we measure gross domestic product and how that might be based on a particular ethnicity and cultural assumptions and things like that. So the idea here is expressed by saying GDP is American. You think of GDP as the sort of core measure of wealth that we use to decide how nations are doing, right, economically. Well, that measure was developed by the American economist Simon Kuznets at Harvard University. What does GDP actually measure? It measures the total value of products that are made in the economy and sold on a market. That's what GDP is designed to measure. But it's important to look at what GDP leaves out, what GDP doesn't measure, and decide if that's valuable. So GDP does not measure destruction or depreciation of buildings and equipment. So when buildings get destroyed, that doesn't make your national wealth go down. It actually makes it go up because you have to put a new building there, for example, even if those buildings were destroyed by war or terror or whatever, or horrible accident. GDP doesn't measure environmental damage at all. It doesn't measure the reduction of available resources. If you overexploit your resources, so you will have a difficult economic future, GDP doesn't measure that. It doesn't measure health. It doesn't measure education level. It doesn't measure any other indication of well-being other than how much money is circulating in the economy. And a lot of people have thought that that really serves a particular culture, maybe a particular political group or power group of very wealthy, white Americans who invest in large corporations. So that's been used as a kind of a critique, a decolonial critique of GDP itself as a measure of wealth. Why are we measuring the thing in this way? Anyway, is that how you really measure the success of an economy? So there have been other attempts to develop different ways of doing it. We've seen one already in sort of a mild attempt when we're talking about the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. But there have been some really more, we'll say, from other cultures, there have been more thorough attempts at redefining how we should be measuring what is the good life and what a good economy should produce is. Maybe GDP is not the thing that we should be using. There are non-American, non-European even alternatives to GDP. One of the most famous is gross national happiness, which is the measure GNH used in Bhutan, the country of Bhutan. It has 4 pillars of gross national happiness, and that's how they measure their policy goals instead of how the GDP is growing. So gross national happiness has 4 components, 4 pillars. The first is sustainable and equitable economic and social development. This is all within ecological sustainability pillar. It has preservation, promotion of free and resilient culture, good governance, and equality before the law. That's what gross national happiness is. And you notice it doesn't really contain much in the way of GDP and economic growth. A second similar attempt has been in Ecuador, where Samut Cauce was ingrained in the constitution of that country as well. And Samut Cauce is a Quechua or indigenous, anyway, term broadly in indigenous Ecuador and really the Andean countries, that means living well. And you live in balance with nature, produce what you need, balance with your community. There's all sorts of, you can see these sort of pillars of Samut Cauce in this picture that have a lot of terms like balance, harmony, community, working with the community, serenity, reciprocity, political organization, working in your community, and things like that. So that they're trying to reevaluate what it is to produce a good life, and saying that that doesn't necessarily relate to gross domestic product. Another one that I've been more involved in is Mino Bambazedwin, and that's an Anishinaabe idea that means something like living a good life. And this is a development model I designed in collaboration with communities of Anishinaabe in the North Shore tribal area of Northern Ontario. We based it on the Anishinaabe medicine wheel, a very common spiritual and policy guiding instrument from that Indigenous community. It was an economic model that we created with community collaboration, or actually was led by the community, instead of me creating it for them. The community really was the one creating the model through their own discourse. And the whole idea of the model, the Mino Bimbazabwin model, is that it builds capacities instead of just access to goods. And it doesn't just measure what the economy is measuring. So what are we measuring when we do this alternative to GDP, essentially in community, in sort of a more regional focus? We measure physical goods. So how much access do people have to food? Are they sufficiently housed? Are they physically healthy? Can they provide their own foods? Can they build their own houses? It's not about just providing goods to people, but how can people understand how to provide for themselves? Physical health, can they promote physical health in themselves and in their communities? Do they help create infrastructure in their communities? Do they have these abilities? Do they benefit from good infrastructure? Healthy natural environment, does that exist? Do they care for their own natural environment in their community? And that's the physical wellness aspect of this model of Mino Bambazabwin. Then we have a spiritual aspect. Well, do they know and teach Indigenous culture? Do they participate in community and ceremonies, which is really important for people? Do they practice in this particular culture the 7 generations model? And do they enact and understand the 7 grandfather teachings? That's a very specific cultural model that we don't have to get in the details of in this course. There's a mental aspect. Does the person have job-related skills? Do they know the language, the Indigenous language? Do they teach those skills and teach that language? Do they know how much Indigenous knowledge do they know? Are they inspired, and can they inspire others? Then there's an emotional aspect. Are they emotionally supportive? Are they emotionally well? Do they have access to therapy? Can they share their stories? Can they listen to others? So if you notice that this model isn't just about what a person has, it's also what a person has the capacity to give. And it's not just about an individual we call a client in this case, but also the community. So the community and the client are kind of the same thing. They build each other in this model. So it's very much not an individualistic model. It's a different place to start from and a different place to measure economic well-being other than just GDP. And interestingly, in one that we've done a couple of papers on this and published, that we've actually used Keynesian economic theory, theories of market failure and whatever, to show how this model can be integrated in Keynesian style economic analysis as well. So you can do the real pluralist economic analysis and not just eject one type of economic analysis and replace it with an Indigenous type, but you can actually be creative and create something new using multiple forms of viewing the economy. So that's decolonial economics in some of its more extreme and less extreme versions. And it provides a lot of insights for how to make maybe a more fair economy and how to really get outside of the box and question what even is an economy and what is it for.